Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. Olor. In the winter of 1897, along the wind-scoured plateau country of southwestern Wyoming, a series of rope lines appeared stretching across open ground between structures that seemed to serve no purpose anyone could immediately understand. The lines ran from a modest timber frame house to a stone-walled cellar set 30 yards distant, then onward to a windbreak constructed of stacked sod and salvaged railroad ties, and finally to a small barn reinforced with double walls packed tight with straw. The woman who built this network was a widow named Althea Drummond, 41 years old, who had arrived in the territory 6 years prior with her husband, a surveyor who died in 1894 when his wagon overturned crossing a spring-swollen creek. What remained after settlement of debts was 60 acres of grazing land, the house, and enough capital to last perhaps 2 seasons if managed with absolute precision. The rope lines puzzled neighbors. Ranch hands from the Vance outfit, 3 miles east, made jokes about a woman who couldn't walk straight without a guide rope. At the mercantile in the scattered settlement known as Drum Flats, the proprietor noted in his ledger that Mistress Drummond had purchased an unusual quantity of Manila hemp rope in August of 1896, $73 worth, at a time when most households spent half that sum on winter provisions. She also ordered 6 kerosene storm lanterns, not the common tin kind but heavy brass models, with thick glass chimneys designed for marine use, costing $2.60 each. The purchases seemed excessive. The distance from her door to her barn was perhaps 40 paces on a clear day. But Althea Drummond had studied weather. In her late husband's surveying records, she found 3 years of daily notations. Wind direction, temperature estimated by the freezing point of various liquids left outdoors, snow depth measured against fence posts, and dates when visibility dropped below 50 feet. Her husband had been meticulous. He had marked in red ink the dates when men were found dead within a quarter mile of shelter, disoriented by what locals called white-out storms. 1873, 2 men. 1879, 1 man. 1886, 3 men and a boy. 1892, 1 man. The pattern showed no pattern, only that it happened, and when it happened, proximity to safety meant nothing if you couldn't find your way. She built accordingly. The cellar was dug 7 feet deep, lined with mortared stone. She hauled herself from a collapsed homestead 12 miles north, working through the summer of 1895 with a borrowed mule and a 2-wheeled cart. The work took 11 weeks. Each trip yielded approximately 300 pounds of usable stone, and she made the journey 47 times, as recorded in a small notebook where she tracked mileage, load weights, and the condition of the mule's hooves. She fitted the cellar with a heavy plank door that opened inward, hinged with iron straps she commissioned from a blacksmith in Rawlins for $8. The door was deliberately oversized, 40 inches wide and 72 inches tall, constructed from 2-inch pine planks, joined with cross beams and reinforced with diagonal bracing. Inside, she installed shelving made from scrap lumber purchased at a defunct sawmill for $6.20. The shelves were spaced 14 inches apart, calculated to accommodate 50-pound flour sacks stacked too high without sagging. She stocked the cellar with 50-pound sacks of white flour, cornmeal, dried beans, slabs of salt pork wrapped in cheesecloth, and 12 gallons of kerosene in sealed tins manufactured by the Continental Oil Company. She kept an accurate inventory in a cloth-bound notebook, listing quantities and the dates items were rotated or consumed. The notebook survives today in the Albany County Historical Collection, Catalogued in 1962 when a distant cousin donated the widow's effects after the property was sold for back taxes. The entries are precise. October 4, 1896. Removed 8 lbs beans, replaced with fresh from mercantile. October 11, 1896. Rotated flour, moved March sacks to front, new sacks to rear. She understood that stored food required management, that flour could spoil if kept too long, that kerosene tins needed inspection for leaks, that salt pork had to be checked for rancidity every 6 weeks. The windbreak she built in stages, starting in May of 1896. She began with a framework of 6x6 timbers cut from ponderosa pine, purchased from a timber camp near Encampment for $19, and delivered on a freight wagon. The timbers were sunk 4 feet into the ground using a post-hole digger and a 16-pound iron bar to break through the caliche layer at 30 inches depth. Each post was braced with diagonal supports cut from 2x4 lumber and secured with hand-forged iron nails, 8 per joint. Against this frame she stacked sod bricks cut from her own land, each brick measuring roughly 12 inches by 8 inches by 4 inches, cut with a sharp spade and left to dry for 2 weeks before placement. She cut and placed 960 bricks over the course of 3 months, working alone except for occasional assistance from a drifter named Isham, who traded labor for meals and shelter for 5 days in June. The resulting wall stood 8 feet high and 20 feet long, positioned to block the northwest wind that came howling down from the Medicine Bow Range each winter with enough force to strip shingles from roofs and topple unsecured outbuildings. Behind the windbreak, she dug a shallow pit 18 inches deep and filled it with gravel hauled from a dry creek bed 2 miles south. She covered the gravel with planks to create a dry standing area where she could work during storms without sinking into mud or snow. She painted the windbreak south face white using lime wash mixed from slaked lime purchased in Rawlins for $3 a barrel. The lime wash was applied in 3 coats during July, each coat allowed to dry for 48 hours before the next application. The result was a surface visible from over 100 yards, even in heavy snow, a beacon that reflected what little light penetrated winter storms. Neighbors considered this labor wasted. Mr. Hosea Vance, who ran 600 head of cattle and employed 11 hands, remarked to his foreman that a lone woman was spending her resources on construction when she ought to be buying breeding stock or finding a man to manage the ranch properly. The foreman, a man named Culliver, repeated this observation at the Drum Flats Mercantile, where it became common opinion. The general sentiment held that Althea Drummond was acting out of fear rather than sense, that she was a widow who didn't understand that Wyoming winters, though harsh, were survivable if you kept your head and stayed close to the fire. Several ranchers pointed out that the Vance outfit, which had operated since 1879, had never needed rope lines or lime-washed walls, and had lost men only in extraordinary circumstances, which, by definition, could not be prepared for. She ignored the commentary. Throughout the summer and fall of 1897, she continued her preparations. She repaired the roof of her house, replacing 17 shingles damaged by spring winds and re-tarring the flashing around the chimney using coal tar purchased from the railroad depot. She reinforced the barn by adding an inner wall of vertical planks, spaced 3 inches from the outer wall, filling the gap with loose straw for insulation. The technique was borrowed from Scandinavian construction methods she had read about in a farming journal published in Wisconsin. The double wall reduced heat loss by an estimated 40%, measurable by the amount of hay her mule consumed, 16 pounds per day in a single-wall barn versus 12 pounds per day in the double-wall configuration, as documented in her expense ledger. In October of 1897, she installed the rope lines. Each line was constructed from 3/4-inch manila hemp rope, purchased in 200-foot coils from a marine supplier in Cheyenne who normally serviced riverboat operators. She paid 82 cents per 100 feet, a premium over standard hemp, because manila fiber resisted rot and maintained flexibility in cold weather. She ran 4 primary lines: house to cellar, cellar to windbreak, windbreak to barn, and barn back to house, creating a closed loop. Each line was tensioned using turnbuckles scavenged from a defunct telegraph installation she discovered while riding fence line in September. The turnbuckles, brass with iron threads, allowed her to maintain tension as the rope stretched or contracted with temperature changes. She anchored the ends to iron posts driven 3 feet into the ground using a sledgehammer and a steel driving cap improvised from a section of pipe. Along each rope every 6 feet, she tied strips of red wool cloth measuring 4 inches by 12 inches, cut from a bolt of fabric purchased for this specific purpose. The red color was chosen because it remained visible in low light and contrasted with snow. She knotted each strip with a clove hitch, followed by a square knot, ensuring the fabric would not slip even when weighted with ice. She tested the system extensively. She walked the lines at night, in fog, during a heavy snow squall in early November, and once while deliberately blindfolded to simulate complete disorientation. The system worked. With one gloved hand on the rope, following the red markers by touch alone, she could move between house, cellar, windbreak, and barn without visual reference to the structures themselves. She timed these journeys: house to cellar, 43 seconds, cellar to windbreak, 51 seconds, windbreak to barn, 37 seconds, barn to house, 1 minute and 2 seconds. She also implemented a routine for storm conditions. Every 6 hours she would walk the full circuit to check for ice buildup on the ropes, using a small mallet to knock off accumulations that could add weight and cause sagging. Every 12 hours, she would inspect the barn, refill water buckets, and ensure her mule and 3 chickens had adequate feed. She had been criticized for keeping chickens through winter. Most ranchers slaughtered laying hens before first snow to avoid the cost of winter feed, but she valued the eggs and considered the feed cost acceptable relative to the protein provided. A hen consuming 4 ounces of cracked corn per day and producing 4 eggs per week represented, by her calculation, a net gain in nutritional value of approximately 30%. November passed. The first significant snow fell on the 23rd, depositing 6 inches overnight. Temperatures dropped to 8 degrees above zero. Althea Drummond tested her systems again, walking the rope lines in darkness, while the wind blew at an estimated 20 miles per hour. Everything held. December began clear and cold. The thermometer outside her kitchen window, a mercury model, accurate to within 2 degrees, registered between 5 and 15 degrees above zero each morning. On the 10th, a brief warm spell brought temperatures up to 32 degrees, melting the surface snow and creating a crust when temperatures dropped again on the 11th. The crust was thick enough to support a walking person, but would break under a horse's weight, a condition that made travel treacherous. On the 17th of December, 1897, the temperature in southwestern Wyoming dropped to 14 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and a storm front moved in from the northwest, bringing winds estimated at 40 miles per hour, and snow that fell so thick it erased the horizon. The storm lasted 2 days. During that time, the Vance outfit lost 12 cattle that wandered from the herd and froze in gullies within a half-mile of the ranch buildings. A shepherder named Ingram camped in a wagon 7 miles south, burned his spare wool blankets and a wooden crate to stay warm when his stove went out. He survived, but lost 3 toes to frostbite and spent 4 weeks recovering at a boarding house in Rawlins, accumulating medical bills that totaled $19.40. And a cowboy named Gideon Corrigan, 28 years old, originally from Missouri, employed by the Vance Ranch as a seasonal hand, got lost. Corrigan had been riding fence line on the 15th, checking for breaks caused by drifting cattle, when his horse stumbled in a concealed ravine and came up lame. The ravine, a natural drainage feature carved by seasonal runoff, was approximately 4 feet deep and invisible under the snow crust. The horse, a 7-year-old bay gelding, injured its left foreleg at the fetlock joint. Corrigan dismounted and examined the injury. The leg was swollen but not broken. He fashioned a lead rope from his lariat and began walking the horse back toward the Vance Ranch headquarters, which he estimated to be 6 or 7 miles northeast. He started walking at approximately 2 in the afternoon. The sky was overcast, but visibility remained adequate, perhaps a quarter mile. He followed what he believed to be the fence line, but the snow had drifted over the lower wires, making the fence difficult to track. By 3:30, light was fading, and the wind was increasing. By 4 o'clock, the storm had arrived in full force. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Corrigan knew the general direction of the ranch, northeast, with the wind on his left cheek. But general direction meant nothing when every step looked identical to the last. He walked what he believed was east. The wind drove into his left side, which seemed correct for an eastward bearing, but wind in a storm doesn't blow straight. It curves and eddies around terrain features, around hills and gullies and stands of sage. By dusk of the 16th, Corrigan was hypothermic, disoriented, and moving in a wide circle that brought him south and west instead of east. He had no matches. They were in his saddlebag, and the saddlebag was on the horse, and the horse had pulled away sometime around midnight when Corrigan collapsed for the first time. He got up, kept moving, because stopping meant freezing. His coat, a canvas duck jacket lined with wool, was rated for temperatures down to 0, but not for sustained exposure to 14 below conditions with wind. His gloves were leather, adequate for riding, but not for extended cold. His boots were standard work boots with smooth soles, and they provided almost no traction on the snow crust. At some point, he could not later recall the hour, he saw a white shape in the gloom. He thought it was a building. He stumbled toward it, no longer leading the horse because the horse was gone, and found himself at Althea Drummond's windbreak. The white lime wash on the south face had done its work, reflecting enough ambient light to be visible at a distance, estimated later at 70 to 80 yards. He collapsed against the sod wall, too exhausted to call out, too cold to think clearly. His body temperature, reconstructed later based on symptoms, was likely between 90 and 92 degrees Fahrenheit, low enough to cause confusion and impaired motor control, but not so low as to induce unconsciousness. Althea Drummond was in her cellar at the time, checking her stores and refilling the storm lanterns with kerosene. She had been living by her strict routine. Every 6 hours, she walked the rope lines to check for ice buildup, and every 12 hours, she inspected the barn where her mule and 3 chickens waited out the storm. She had noted in her weather journal, maintained since her husband's death, that the barometric pressure had dropped significantly on the 15th, from 29.8 inches to 28.6 inches, a fall that historically preceded major storms. She had prepared accordingly, bringing extra firewood into the house, filling every available bucket with water from the well before the well casing froze, and moving 2 full kerosene tins from the cellar to the kitchen for easy access. When she emerged from the cellar just before dark on the 16th, she followed the rope line toward the windbreak to begin her circuit check. The wind was blowing at full strength, and the rope line vibrated in her hand like a bowstring. The red wool markers were glazed with ice, but still tactile. She moved slowly, testing each step, using the rope for balance and direction. When she reached the windbreak, she paused in the sheltered area behind it to catch her breath. That was when she saw Corrigan slumped against the wall with snow accumulating on his back and shoulders. She did not panic. She approached and shook his shoulder. He responded but did not speak coherently. She assessed the situation quickly. He was alive, mobile enough to walk with assistance, and there was no obvious severe injury such as broken bones or bleeding. She made her decision. She could not carry him, but she could guide him. She got him upright. He outweighed her by 70 pounds, and positioned his right hand on the rope line. She spoke directly into his ear, loudly enough to be heard over the wind. "Hold the rope. Do not let go. Follow me." She led him along the rope line from windbreak to barn. The journey took nearly 4 minutes, 3 times longer than normal, because Corrigan stumbled twice and she had to stop and reposition him. At the barn she opened the door. It swung inward, sheltered from the wind, and guided him inside. She seated him on a straw bale near the mule's stall and left him there while she went back outside, following the rope line to the windbreak a second time to check for the horse. She found it standing near the wall, head down, ice forming on its mane. She led the horse into the barn, using the rope line, and speaking low to keep the animal calm. She removed its tack, noting the swollen fetlock, rubbed it down with straw, and covered it with a canvas sheet she kept for this purpose. Then she returned to Corrigan. He was conscious but unresponsive to questions. His hands were clumsy, and his speech slurred. She recognized the signs. She had seen hypothermia before, in her husband during a winter survey trip in 1892, when he fell through ice on a frozen creek and took 30 minutes to dry his clothes by a fire. She guided Corrigan back along the rope line from barn to house, a journey that took 6 minutes because he moved slowly and had to rest twice. At the house, she brought him inside and seated him in a corner of the main room, away from the stove. She did not try to warm him quickly. She had read in a medical handbook published in 1889 by a physician named Dr. Virgil Thatcher in Cheyenne that rapid rewarming of frozen limbs could cause shock and tissue damage, that the blood vessels and extremities needed time to adapt as circulation returned. Instead, she removed his wet outer clothing, replacing his jacket with a dry wool blanket, and left him to warm gradually while she heated broth on the stove. The broth was made from salt pork bones she kept simmering in a pot at the back of the stove, a technique that provided continuous hot liquid with minimal fuel consumption. She served the broth in a tin cup, holding it for him, because his hands shook too badly to grip. Over the next 4 hours, Corrigan regained coherence. His shivering became less violent, his speech cleared, his hand steadied enough to hold the cup himself. He asked where he was. Althea Drummond told him he was approximately 4.5 miles southwest of the Vance Ranch headquarters on her property. He expressed confusion, then shock, then embarrassment. He had missed his target by miles. He had walked in circles. She asked if he had matches. He said they were in his saddlebag. She asked if he had a compass. He said no. She asked if he had followed the wind. He said yes. She explained that wind direction shifts in storms, that following wind is not navigation. He listened, nodded, said nothing. The storm did not relent until the evening of the 18th. During that time, Corrigan remained at the Drummond house. He slept on a pallet near the stove, ate simple meals of cornmeal mush and fried salt pork, and helped with minor chores, splitting kindling, carrying water from the cellar, tending the stove. He noticed the rope lines. He noticed the lanterns hung at intervals inside the barn. He noticed the cellar stocked with food enough for months, the double-walled barn, the windbreak with its white painted face. He asked why she had built all this. She answered plainly, because winters kill people who aren't ready. He asked how she knew what to build. She showed him her husband's weather journal, the pages filled with dates and temperatures and measurements of snow and wind. She showed him the medical handbook, the chapter on hypothermia, marked with a slip of paper. She showed him her inventory notebook, the careful records of food rotation and consumption rates. He asked if she had always been this careful. She said no. She said that after her husband died, she had spent the first winter relying on neighbors for help, accepting charity, feeling diminished. She said that in the spring of 1895, she decided she would not be dependent, that she would prepare her own household to survive whatever came. She said it took 2 years to build what she had built, and that neighbors had mocked her for it, and that she had ignored them because mockery was easier to endure than freezing. When the wind finally dropped and the sky cleared on the 19th, Corrigan walked back to the Vance ranch, leading his still lame horse. The journey took 5 hours. He arrived late in the afternoon. Mr. Vance had presumed him dead and had sent no search party. The storm made search impossible, and men caught in such conditions either found shelter or did not. Company policy, unwritten but understood, held that cowboys were responsible for their own survival during storms. The ranch provided tools and wages, but not rescue. Corrigan reported that he had survived by finding the Drummond place. Vance asked how. Corrigan described the white windbreak, the rope lines, the widow who had guided him to safety and housed him for 3 days. Vance listened, paused, then asked if the widow had fed him. Corrigan confirmed. Vance said nothing more, but paid Corrigan through the end of the month and told him to take the lame horse to a veterinary farrier in Rawlins. Word spread. By January of 1898, the story of the lost cowboy and the widow's rope lines had become a topic of discussion at the Mercantile, at the church social in Drum Flats, at the saloon in Rawlins, where ranch hands gathered during slow months. Opinions divided. Some held that Corrigan had been lucky, that he might have found any shelter, and the widow's preparations were coincidental. Others pointed out that he had seen the white wall from a distance in near-zero visibility, which suggested the preparations were not coincidental at all, but instrumental. A few ranchers began asking questions. How much did rope cost? How deep should a cellar be dug? What kind of lanterns lasted longest in wind? In February, Hosea Vance himself visited the Drummond property. He came alone, riding a gray gelding, and dismounted at the front gate. Althea Drummond was outside, repairing a section of rope line that had frayed where it rubbed against a fence post. Vance removed his hat and apologized for his prior remarks. He said he had been wrong to dismiss her methods. He asked if she would consider advising his operation on storm preparations. She agreed, on the condition that he pay her in materials, specifically enough timber and hardware to build 2 additional windbreaks on her property, positioned to shelter the southeast and southwest approaches. Vance agreed, and by the end of March, 2 more windbreaks stood on the Drummond Ranch, built by Vance's crew under Althea Drummond's direction. In March, a civil engineer named Morton Fisk, employed by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, visited the Drummond Ranch to document her infrastructure. Fisk had been tasked with compiling a manual of best practices for isolated homesteads and line camps, a project funded by the association after 3 winters of high losses due to disorientation and exposure. He measured the rope lines, noting the 6-foot marker intervals and the turnbuckle tension system. He sketched the windbreak design, recording the post depth, the sod brick dimensions, the lime wash formula. He photographed the cellar interior using a large format camera, capturing the shelving layout and the inventory system. His notes, archived in the association's records and later transferred to the University of Wyoming Library in 1964, include detailed drawings of the rope line anchor system, the turnbuckle placement, and the red wool marker specifications. Fisk noted in his summary report, the subject's preparations, though initially regarded as excessive by neighboring ranchers, proved life-saving during the December storm and merit wider adoption. Estimated implementation cost for a standard homestead, $45 for materials, 10 days of labor. Estimated benefit, significant reduction in cold weather fatalities and livestock losses due to improved navigation and shelter access during whiteout conditions. The manual was published by the Stock Growers Association in June of 1898 under the title Practices for Storm Safety on Isolated Range Properties. It was distributed free to members and sold for 50 cents to non-members. By 1900, rope line systems had been installed at 47 ranches and line camps across Wyoming and Montana. by 1905, the number exceeded 200. The systems varied in complexity. Some used wire instead of rope, some used painted posts instead of windbreaks. But the principle remained constant: provide a physical guide that could be followed without vision. Corrigan, for his part, left Wyoming in April of 1898. He moved to Montana and took work on a ranch near Miles City, where he introduced rope line systems to the winter camp infrastructure. He corresponded briefly with Althea Drummond, sending 2 letters in which he described the methods he had implemented and thanked her for her pragmatism. The letters survive in the Albany County collection, written in a careful hand on lined paper. The first letter, dated May 12, 1898, reads in part, "We have installed lines as you showed me, 400 feet total, with red cloth every 6 feet, as you specified. The foreman was skeptical but agreed to try. Thank you for saving my life and teaching me to respect preparation." The Drummond Ranch operated until 1906, when Althea Drummond, then 50 years old, sold the property to a cattle syndicate for $800 and moved to Laramie, where she lived modestly on the proceeds and worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a hardware supplier. She kept a small apartment on Grand Avenue, attended the Methodist Church, and lived without incident until 1923, when she died of pneumonia at age 67. She was buried in the Green Hill Cemetery under a plain granite marker that recorded her name, her birth and death years, and nothing more. Her estate, valued at $412, went to a cousin in Illinois who never visited Wyoming and who sold her few possessions through an estate agent in Laramie. The rope lines remained on the Drummond property until the early 1930s, when the new owners removed them during a renovation, considering them outdated in an era of improved weather forecasting and motorized transport. The windbreaks, however, stood until 1951, when one was dismantled for salvage and the other collapsed during a severe spring wind. The cellar remained intact and was rediscovered in 1962 during a property survey conducted by a civil engineering firm contracted to assess foundation stability for a planned expansion. The cellar still contained rusted kerosene tins and fragments of burlap sacks. The survey report noted the craftsmanship of the stonework and the unusual depth of the excavation. The story of Gideon Corrigan and Althea Drummond became, in time, a minor footnote in regional history, cited in homesteading manuals and occasionally mentioned in county histories. But the lesson it carried, the lesson of preparation, not for the likely but for the possible, of building beyond what seems necessary because necessity cannot be predicted, of the dignity in quiet foresight, that lesson endured. It endured in the rope lines installed at isolated camps across Wyoming and Montana through the early 1900s. It endured in the weather journals kept by surveyors and homesteaders who learned to document patterns rather than trust memory. It endured in the understanding that survival on the frontier was not a matter of courage or luck, but of calculation and relentless, unglamorous preparedness. And it endured, perhaps most significantly, in the realization that those who prepare for disaster are often mocked right up until the moment disaster arrives, at which point mockery gives way to gratitude, or at the very least, to silence. The frontier did not forgive carelessness. It did not reward optimism. It rewarded those who built their shelters strong, stocked their cellars deep, and strung their lines tight, because when the storm came, and the storm always came, there would be no second chance to get it right. Althea Drummond understood this. Gideon Corrigan learned it. And the hundreds of ranchers and homesteaders who installed rope lines and built windbreaks and kept weather journals in the years that followed, they carried forward a truth that remains relevant beyond the specific context of Wyoming winters. That preparation is a form of respect for the power of nature and the fragility of human life, and that the work of building systems that save lives is never wasted, even when those lives are your own.